Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my pleasure to welcome to today's program Tony Martins, who is the VP of Strategic Services at Halo Pharmaceutical. And we're going to be talking about today social networking and companies of tomorrow. Those of you that have been following me on the blog and have followed my work for a number of years know that I'm a huge proponent of social networking in supply chain management and just in business in general. And Tony is certainly not only a practitioner who has experience with social networking, but is also what I consider a thought leader in this whole area as well. So I look forward to engaging in this conversation with Tony. Just as a reminder, part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to have you, the audience, engage with our guests. So if you've got a question for Tony as we're having our conversation here, you can go ahead and submit it via the submit a question button or via the chat feature, and I'll keep an eye on that. And if there's a good question, I'll go ahead and weave it into the conversation. If you are logged in as a guest, just a reminder that you do have to register first in order to ask a question. So with that, Tony, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. Pleasure to be here.
So Tony, before we kind of get to the topic, I always like to ask my guests, particularly practitioners, how they got involved in the supply chain logistics field. So can you tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are?
Sure. Like many people, especially people from my generation, we don't get off of school ready to manage supply chains. In fact, at that time, the notion of a supply chain, I think, didn't exist, or let alone supply chain management as a practice. So I stumbled upon it by more or less accident and circumstance. Most of my career, I actually was working in IT consulting and enterprise systems, and a good 22 years of that. And I moved from first I was working in managing projects, then I went on to architecting systems, and then to focusing on business processes. And sometime around the year 2000, 2001, I was engaged in a consulting assignment at a paper company where they were starting to look at supply chain management, and they needed some help looking at their processes and how to use technology and so on. So I came in and took a look at that, and that's when I came in touch with the practice of supply chain management. And since supply chain management is basically business processes, it's basically processes and information, so it was easy for me to blend into it. I learned that I developed my own practice, and then I went on to work in a pharmaceutical company who as the ad used to say, the old IBM ad, you're a consultant and you come in, you make a recommendation, and you walk out. Well, in my case, they said, well, it's such a good idea, why don't you come and do it? So I was invited to be a VP of supply chain, and I was there for almost 10 years now. So I moved from that company to another, but I've been on that thread managing supply chains for a good 10 years now.
Great. And I think it's kind of interesting that you came out of the IT background, because I think that I'm going to assume that that's probably played a big role in terms of kind of your passion and your ideas around the role of social networking being a type of technology, and the potential impact that it could have on supply chain. So that brings me to my next question. Before we kind of talk about some of the ideas and your thoughts around supply chain, like I mentioned in my opening, you're one of the few supply chain executive that I know that not only sees the potential value of social networking, has practical experience in leveraging it. You're also kind of a thought leader and a visionary in this area, and you launched your own blog where you kind of write about this topic at cybersupplychain.com. So I'm kind of curious why or how did you become so interested in social networking, and why even launch a blog and write about it?
Well, I got in I got in touch with social networking not by looking for social networking or even for asking the question, what do we do with it? I was in a situation when I started managing supply chains where there was a very, very, very difficult problem, and the problem was an operations problem. So work in a pharmaceutical company. We have a pharmaceutical plant. It's a manufacturing plant. A lot of activities going on in making medical products. And making medical products is not a precise science. There are many problems that occur, things that you don't expect to happen, things that go wrong, the materials that don't perform as expected, things that take longer than they should, mistakes that people make, and so on. And what I noticed was that a lot of product that was flowing through the supply chain would get stuck because there was a problem that, of course, unless it's solved, you can't move on. And nobody would know that there was a problem. So you would have like an instance of a product being made, it gets stuck, it's halfway through the process. There is a problem preventing it from going on. Someone has to intervene. But what I found is, by and large, the people that encounter the problem can't solve the problem. So other people in the organization have to solve the problem. So what would happen is that product or that portion of a product would be stuck on the line. They would take it out, put it on the warehouse, and sit there for months at times until finally the event would surface at some management level, where people would then take a look and start doing something. And and this wouldn't happen with one instance of a product. So in the pharmaceutical industry, we make products in batches. So it wouldn't happen to just one batch. It would have, in that case, I found 500 batches that were somewhere in the warehouse, waiting for somebody to resolve the problem that was preventing it from carrying on. And so I realized that the biggest difficulty that we had, the biggest challenge that we had, was to detect that there was a problem. And I wanted to be able to find that something went wrong at the time that it went wrong, and then bring the problem to everybody with the skills to solve it. And that's how I came across. At the time, the technology was very primitive, but I found SharePoint, and then I found SharePoint message boards, and I created a process for people on the floor, people in the organization, anywhere that would encounter a problem that would stop the supply chain, to post that problem on the board. And then I created a mechanism for other people from the organization to respond to the problem. And that's how I came across the utilization of virtual spaces, a message board being a virtual space, to allow issues, information, comments, knowledge to flow very rapidly from one area of the organization to another area of the organization. And then later on, I expanded the application of that concept to issues in the supply chain, not only inside our organization, but also outside the organization. And I created virtual spaces between our company and our supply chain partners, mainly subcontractors, but in some cases, even suppliers. And that's what created my metaphor to leverage the utilization of virtual spaces in the workplace. And then subsequently, as the years rolled on, what I just described to you happened in 2005. So around 2008, 9, 10, by then, Facebook became became what it became, a massive experience for society. And the Facebook metaphor, the constructs of conversations and other things, became standard in the Web 2.0 toolkit, and companies started making mature products, and I started using those mature products. And so today, of course, there are much better tools than the old SharePoint message boards, and in my business, we use other tools. But that has been my experience and my focus, is how to use virtual spaces, and which I refer to in my blog as cyberspace, which is why it's called cyber supply chain. How do we bring activities that usually occur in offices and in boardrooms and meeting rooms, and with all the limitations that entails, how do we bring all that activity and those conversations into a virtual space so that we can leverage all of the benefits of working in the virtual space? And my blog is about that, and it proposes ideas and methods and approaches to transform the brick and mortar workplace into a virtual workplace or social workplace.
No, that's a great example. I mean, I think people often ask, when I'm in conversations with folks in terms of, what's the value of social networking or some of these technologies, and where's the, how do you calculate the ROI or what's the value proposition? And I think you hit on a point that I always tell people in terms of, the potential for these technologies to that first of all, these technologies are just another tool to communicate and collaborate. And what the most common area that we have to communicate and collaborate is to solve problems that happen. Supply chain is about exception and exception management. And I think the example you just gave in terms of that being kind of the catalyst for you to start exploring these virtual workspaces, to be able to solve problems and be able to bring a broader community into that process, I think is a great example. So let's talk a little bit about your blog and some of the ideas and things you've written about on your blog, and let's start kind of at a high level right now. One of your blog posts is you say that the most important question for CEOs of growing companies is this: Are you creating a company of yesterday, or are you creating a company of tomorrow, today? What do you mean by that, and what are the attributes of a company of tomorrow versus a company of today?
Yeah, so well, companies of yesterday are the best known because most companies are companies of yesterday. So what do I mean when I refer to that, and why is it that there is a thing that I refer to as a company of tomorrow? What's the inflection point between the two? By and large, the standard corporate model, the standard corporation of the 20th century, is based on a model that most people don't know, but was really created or at least formalized by General Motors, sometimes in 1920, by Mr. Sloan. So was running General Motors at the time, and that model prevailed throughout the 20th century because the circumstances that justified and in fact required that type of model in the 1920s prevailed also for most of the 1920s, most of the 20th century. The 20th century was a century, the industrial century. It was a century where companies basically were created, they developed, and they focused on producing lots of stuff. It was the production century. Production was, and producers were the core of the economy. In sometime in the past 50 years, things started to change, and I kind of look at it as the point where things started to change more rapidly was around 1989, 1990. 1989 specifically was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the communist world, and so on. Now think about it. What happened at the same time? The PCs, PC became popular in companies because of the local area network. The prices of PCs collapsed. After that came the internet and the Netscape browser, and then from fast forward a little more, and you get into the dot-com crisis, and then you got MySpace and Facebook and so on and so forth. At the same time, a lot of other things are changing. Technology is changing. Science is changing. So what I see happening around the turn of the 21st century is that there is a convergence of some massive changes across society and the economy across the globe, which are creating a completely new paradigm, dramatically different from the conditions of the 20th century. In fact, the last time that this happened was at the turn of the previous century, around the year 1900. If you think about it, some major things, some major underpinnings of any civilization are changing and have changed already dramatically. Science and technology, the queen sciences, as I call them, in the 21st century didn't even exist, certainly not in a mature form 50 years ago. Software engineering, nanotechnology, bioengineering, genetics, and quantum mechanics. It's interesting that the science of the 19th and 20th century was used to create big things, and the science of today is creating things that we can't even see because they're at the submolecular level. So it's a very, very different world. The second thing that has changed a lot in the past 10 years alone is the way people communicate, which is always a cornerstone of a big change in society. And the last time it was the telegraph that was associated with the changes of the 19th century, certainly a catalyst. So now we have people communicating in a completely different way in very large numbers. If you think about it, in the 1970s, 1980s, an average teenager would have maybe a dozen friends that he could reach out to and talk to. Today, an average teenager on Facebook has over 400 friends. It's just amazing the scale at which this new form of communication allows us to function. And the final thing that really clinches it all and makes it that we're already past the inflection point is demographics. By the end of this decade, baby boomers will make up 25% of the workforce, just a quarter of the workforce. So in the course of the next few years, generation X, Y, and maybe some generation Z are going to take over the workplace. What are they going to do? They're going to do something completely different from before because they have completely different habits on how they socialize, and the workplace is a social place. So companies of tomorrow today, what characterizes them is that they are riding the wave. This is a wave of massive, massive change. And these companies are learning how to, or know how to succeed and drive this mammoth change. They are typically great innovators because they become different companies by questioning everything that existed before. So if you work on a company of tomorrow, you don't take anything for granted. You never say, this is how I've done it for the past 20 years. You don't say that, in my career, I've done this, it always worked, why wouldn't it work now? I'm this big shot, I have 30 years of experience, I've done this many times, and so on. That's a recipe for disaster because the conditions are just so different than many things that you learned in the past and that you're accustomed to aren't going to work. You have to start looking in a completely different way. So companies of tomorrow are great innovators. They question everything that has existed in the past. They are fearless about creating new organizational models, new business models, new approaches at doing things. If you think of it like Apple, Google, Amazon, or Facebook, these companies aren't just innovators, they're disruptive innovators. They have completely disrupted sectors of the economy, complete total industries that they have either disrupted or even created. So that's the company of tomorrow. You don't work in companies of tomorrow don't work in a traditional hierarchical top-down functional structure. They abandon that. They have to, because functional structures are extremely slow, and functional structures do not allow people to work in virtual spaces and to work in social communities, and therefore social functional structures prevent organizations from moving from the model of yesterday to the model of tomorrow. So if you want to know, if you're starting a company, you're a new CEO, you're starting a company, a startup, or it's been around for 3, 4, 5 years, ask yourself the question, are you doing something that has already been done? And are you doing it the same way it was done 5 or 10 years ago? If the answer to both questions is yes, you will probably become irrelevant before you become a great company. You will not have no chance to become a great company because you are essentially following the dinosaurs, right? Like if you were a dinosaur 60 something million years ago, you would know what's going to happen to you. So what do you want to do? You don't want to be a dinosaur. You want to be a mouse. Apparently mice and frogs survived the thing. So you have to think completely differently. If you're stuck in the paradigms of yesterday, I know people that worked in a very large company. They reached the age of 50, 52, 53. They left and they created a new company, small company, startup. I'm going to do better than the other guys. But they do exactly the same thing. They're creating the big company and a small company. They're doing it all over again. 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, this might work. Today it doesn't. If you're going to do something new, you have to do something completely different. You have to bring in lots of young people, so you learn from the young people new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things. You have to leave your big ego at home so that it doesn't get in the way and causes disaster. You have to be extremely open-minded, and you have to abandon the habits that you grew up with. It's a very hard thing to do. It's no surprise that most companies of tomorrow are started by very young people because older people have a really hard time doing what I just said.
Lot of food for thought there, Tony. I think I guess if I were to kind of package it into a small nugget, you know, you really talked about kind of the rapid change that's taking place in technology and in business models, obviously the generational and demographic changes that are occurring. And the bottom line is that you know the processes, the organizational structures, so on and so forth, that were you know the right, perhaps the right approach for the given time, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you know, just because of the rate, how quickly things are changing today and the very dynamic nature of today's business environment, you really need to organize differently, work differently, and manage, you know, your supply chains in different ways. And like you said, I mean, it's a classic change management. It's not an easy, you know, changing what have been proven and you know this is the way I've always done it. It's been successful. This was a best in class way of doing things. It's very hard to change from that mindset. I want to jump off something you said and kind of get into another topic that you've written about, which I think contrasts a little bit kind of kind of the ways of working today or a process for a company of tomorrow versus perhaps an established process that many companies are undergoing today, which is, you know, you talk about managing in now mode, and you've contrasted it on the website with kind of the traditional S&OP process. So if you know, you can argue that maybe the traditional S&OP process is and what, or maybe was a best in class process that made sense, you know, years ago, but that, you know, perhaps there are limitations to it. So what do you mean by, you know, managing in now mode, and how does that, you know, how does that differ from kind of, let's say, the traditional SNLP process? And you also say that it can only be done or be done effectively via social networking. So how does social networking enable managing in now mode?
So if we talk about the traditional S&OP process, it's a good context in which to explain what now mode is. In simple terms, now mode means that if it's happening now, you deal with it now. It's kind of saying don't procrastinate, but it's more fundamental than that. So if there's an event occurring in your business environment, the supply chain, with your customers, suppliers, in your own environment, doesn't matter. If there's an event occurring, you got to deal with it now. You can't wait even a week. You can't wait for the next time that 50 people are going to be available for a meeting. You have to deal with it right now. That's what now mode means. You don't accumulate things. There are no queues. There isn't a stack of things to deal with, and so I'm going to do this one first and that one 50th. There's none of that. So in now mode, things don't accumulate. They happen now. We deal with them now. Now, if we go to an S&OP, the traditional S&OP, and let me first express what I mean by traditional, because maybe not everybody sees it the same way. But traditional S&OP process, it's really a packaging of the most basic supply chain management practices, isn't it? So first week of the month, we got some data from last month about all the actual sales orders that came in, and we do a bit of demand planning, we do some statistical forecasting, and so on and so forth. And eventually, out of that process comes a forecast. That forecast now moves to the next step. Next step is to see, do we have enough capacity to meet demand? So we do some capacity analysis, we do some supply planning. We look at inventory and look at where we have enough stock, don't have enough stock outs, and so on and so forth. And eventually get to a point where you have a supply plan that says we can meet demand, or we can meet demand this way, and in this and this other case we cannot. And then people go and they produce a ton of reports or KPIs or graphs or whatever to bring all of this information about demand, about supply, about issues into some graphical form and into a collection of slides. And then eventually you got this famous S&OP meeting, which not everybody does it the same way or for the same reason. It used to be that this is a sort of confrontation between sales and operations to see if they get to a common agreement. Fine. If you need something to deal with if you need to deal with the difference between how sales see things and operations sees things through a meeting, I think you have a bigger problem. So these days, I think people on a more practical level, they go take a look at these numbers and what the outlook for the next few months is like, and they learn something from it. They may make some decisions if you're lucky, and you move on. So this, what I've just outlined, is what I see as a traditional sales and operations process. Yeah. Now, why is it a problem? So the problem is that it takes three weeks usually to deal with something that happened already last month. To begin with, you're doing demand planning with data that is that's old. By the time you get to the third week of the month, demand has already changed. The world doesn't stop moving while everybody is having these meetings and producing these graphs. The data that you see on the graphs on the third week of the month is already obsolete. I remember many times going through these sessions um, with the standard graphs and having additional graphs to bring everybody up to date to what happened in the past 3 weeks. It doesn't make any sense, not for the world that goes very fast. In the days in the 70s, the 80s, maybe even part of the 90s, when the economy ran at a predictable pace. We had the recession here a few years later, another one, and a few years later, and that it was easy. There weren't as many industries, things weren't as complicated, they weren't changing all the time. So in those days, yeah, fine. So you get the data from last month, you do some planning, you show it on the third week of the month, the plan is still pertinent. Today, I don't believe that that's the case because the world around us is changing too much, and I don't just mean nanotechnology and so on. I mean even competitive forces, availability of products, the impact of globalization. Everything just changes too much. So you can't wait 3 weeks to realize that something isn't working. Even worse, to realize that you can't do anything about it. So the basic techniques of demand planning or supply planning, MRP, capacity, using APS as ERP, so all that's fine. I mean, these are all good things. It's the timeline that is used to deploy them that doesn't work. So in now mode, first of all, nothing is sequential or cyclical. So you don't do demand planning and then supply planning and then capacity planning. You do all of it at the same time. It's not cyclical. That means that we don't do anything once a week or once a month. We do it when it's needed. In now mode, you manage supply chain by exception, and you manage based on events. You react to events. You can be proactive by anticipating events in the future, but whether it is by reacting to something that's happening today or something you think is going to happen in 3 weeks or 3 months, you always applying your skill of how to manage supply to respond to demand. You're applying that skill on a moment notice. It's moment by moment. What you have to have is you have to use your ability to produce KPIs to detect that something went wrong that you need to react to. In now mode, we work in what I call instance mode. So let me give you an example. If you if you look at an inventory report, you're going to see inventory of all the SKUs in the warehouse, right? How useful is that? For whom? Who is it that manages all the SKUs, right? And if you know the inventory of a SKU, that's nothing. You need to know the inventory, you need to know demand, you need to know upcoming receipts, you need to know what's the supply plan, and so on. So the problem with the traditional approaches of managing the supply chain is that they're not working in instance mode, they're working in stacks of instances, right? Whereas in now mode, you take, if there's an event that affects, let's say, 1, 3, 4 SKUs, you take those 4 SKUs and you rearrange the supply chain for those 4 SKUs. And so you look at demand, you look at supply, you look at delays, production schedule, and so on for those 4 SKUs end to end. In my teams, we organize supply chain analysts by supply chain. A supply chain analyst is going to handle an entire supply chain from beginning to end. We don't have people who do purchasing and then people who do production and then people who do customer service. You have one supply chain analyst that does everything from end to end, but only for a few products. And then their job is to detect that something is going wrong in that flow for that particular product and to fix it and do it as it occurs. You don't wait for the next management meeting. We don't wait for the next weekly review meeting. We don't wait for anything. You do it right now. So that's what now mode is and how it differs from the traditional cyclical monthly S&OP process, which I think is condemned to disappear in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe sooner. Now, you mentioned that, yeah, I say that social networking helps this. So people cannot, the only way that people can work in now mode, yeah, is if they are permanently connected. So if I have a problem and I need to solve it, I need to change my supply chain, I have to be able to reach out to all the individuals that can help me solve the problem immediately. I can't wait for them to be present physically in a meeting room. So I don't know of any other way that individuals of multiple skills spread over an organization, sometimes spread over different geographies, can come together and collaborate instantly other than using virtual spaces, which is why I'm so passionate about using cyberspace as a workplace, because in cyberspace we can overcome distance, we can overcome, we can do things in parallel, we can multitask, we can, people can contribute when they can. They don't have to contribute all at the same time. They can come in when they can. They can deal with many issues at the same time. That's the only way that I think it's possible to work in now mode. And I'm convinced there are many organizations that are already doing this. And if your organization isn't, at some point, you're going to fall behind.
You know, a lot of different things you touched upon there, and obviously kind of different way of organizing a team, different way to approach the exceptions. And you just talked a little bit about how the social networking can help in terms of bringing the resources and teams together to operate in now mode. I'm wondering, as I look at, I do a lot of work with and follow a lot of the leading supply chain logistics software vendors out there and their solutions. Uh, and arguably, those solutions have been architected or try to model the traditional, processes. Do you see a limitation there with kind of the systems that companies use, or the software available today to do demand planning, to do, forecasting, so on, inventory management, so on and so forth? Are those tools architected correctly to operate in now mode, or is there some innovation that needs to take place by the software vendors and the technology community to make those tools more flexible or align them more with kind of the now way of working that you just talked about?
Well, for starters, there aren't many. There's maybe two or three that are widely deployed. You got the SAP ERPs and APSs, and you got the Oracle ERPs and APSs, and you got maybe recently I've came across Infor, which seems to have acquired a bunch of tools, but there aren't 15 of these. There's just two or three, and they're all very similar in the way that they are architected and the way they function. Although they'll probably get mad at me for saying that, but on the fundamentals, they do the same thing. Now, can they cope with now mode? Yes, because usually at the processing level. So we think about just the processing of information, doing MRP runs, doing statistical forecasting, and so on. Just the processing stuff. I don't think they need to be touched, because usually you can run them for masses of information. You can also run them for instances or selected instances. So that part is okay. The part that you need to work on a little more, which is the easy part, is output in the traditional report and the traditional form of extracting information from data warehouses and creating reports and creating graphs. Because a report, by design, is not good for you to operate in now mode. Reports are terrible for now mode because they're functional and they show you all the instances. You want a sales report by territory, you see all the territories. You don't see one, you see all of them. And then if you want profit and loss, well, you see all of the items. If you want to see inventory, but you don't really have views that show you demand, supply, inventory for a few instances. So you need to work around that a little bit. It's not very difficult, because the beauty of now mode is that you spread the work and you spread the responsibility by many individuals. And so a single individual can do a little bit of work extracting data and even using simple things like Excels and spreadsheets to create individual views. It doesn't really matter if you're going outside of those basic tools. What's important is you're able to get the information out, detect that something is wrong, analyze it, get some more information, analyze some more, and then resolve it. I think most systems, the systems that are out there that were deployed probably in the past 10, 20 years, they can do the job. It's just getting rid of reports and replacing it by different ways of looking at data. That's the part that needs a little bit more work. But again, as I said, it can be spread by many people. It doesn't have to be done by traditional way, a single person in IT is going to pump all these things out, because that's not the now mode way. That's the old way, right?
Right, right. Well, more recently, kind of putting everything together now, you started, writing and thinking about, how to organize kind of the workplace to operate in now mode and to make use of social networking technologies. And you've developed a model called the Hive method, where Hive stands for Human Interaction Virtual Environment. And, I have to admit, I read the postings and I've read some of your writing there. I'm still trying to put my arms around it. I think it's very interesting ideas you put forth. But so I invite the audience to kind of visit your blog and kind of read more about it. But can you give us kind of the elevator pitch on what Hive is all about?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, um, uh, people of multiple skills can come together in a virtual space and collaborate and resolve problems to get things done. So you create an environment, you have virtual spaces, and you put people into those virtual spaces. Here's a big question. There's 1,500 people in your organization. What do you do? Is there just one large pool and everybody jumps in there and everybody talks about everything? Obviously not. So how do you partition the organization into individual spaces so that fewer individuals can deal with the fewer workload as opposed to getting involved with everything? How do you partition the organization? Uh, if I didn't say anything else and I asked people from 20 organizations of 20 different industries to go and partition the virtual spaces so that people could work inside each of them, what would they do? They would create an HR space and an IT space and a marketing space and a business development space and so on. That's the wrong way to do it. In fact, that's a waste of time because it'll never work. So what I did is I created a method to help people decide how to arrange these virtual spaces to make them very effective. And that's what the Hive model is. So a Hive, so what you do with the Hive method is you create Hive units. A Hive unit, or a Hive in short, is essentially a collection of individuals of multiple skills that have a single focus. That single focus is what I call the mission of the Hive. It's very important to keep in mind, you don't create a mission for a Hive. You create a Hive for a mission. So you have to know what the mission is. And a mission, which you can call a goal or an objective or a responsibility, has to be something that a customer can understand and would be willing to pay for. So as an example, if you're a software developer and you have a group of people coding and another group of people testing, which you might have if you're functionally oriented, you can't create a Hive for programming, because a program that is not tested, is not bug free, is of no interest to a customer. So a mission for a Hive could not be to deliver code. You can have a Hive, though, that is going to deliver software that is tested and bug-free, ready for deployment. That's a good focus for a Hive. So you could have a Hive for that. If you're in a bank and you have a Hive to manage loans, that's not a good Hive, because typically in a customer relationship you will find loans and mortgages and investments and so on. So what you can have a Hive to manage customer relationships. Then you are providing a view that a customer can understand and would be willing to pay for. It's a more complex, more complete service. So a Hive then is associated with an end goal or an end result that a customer relates to. And as a result, in that Hive, what you're going to do is you're going to assign to the Hive people of all the skills that are needed to deliver that one result. Now, if that means 1,000 people, then what you can do is you can partition the goal. So you could say, for instance, this is a company in the materials world that's producing products. You create a Hive to deliver supply to the market with great service. That's your Hive. But instead of having a single Hive like that, you could have 3 or 4. You could have one Hive for a certain line of products, another Hive for another line of products, another Hive for another line of products. You could have similar Hives with similar objectives, but responsible only for a piece of the business. The most important thing is that all the skills involved in delivering that promise is inside the hive, and then everybody in the hive is going to be in a virtual space that is assigned to that hive, and they're going to collaborate dynamically in handling all the issues and performing all the business related to that one result. So that's what the hive is for.
Great. I think I have a little bit better understanding of what you mean by now. So I'm going to go back and now read the postings after listening to you actually talk about it. And again, I invite the folks in the audience to take a read at it as well. I just want to remind everyone we've got a couple of questions left here. We're kind of running short on time. So if you do have a question for Tony on anything we've talked so far, or maybe you've got a question, on something we haven't touched upon yet, do so via the submit a question button or the live chat feature, and I'll see if I can weave it in. I want to go back to kind of wrap up this conversation. I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the company of tomorrow and versus a company of today. And I think if you mentioned some of the companies of tomorrow, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, so on and so forth. And those, relatively speaking, are relatively new companies. They've been were started in the last 10 or so years, 10, 15 years. But then you've got, the established multinational companies that have been around for 30, 50, 100 years, right? How does a company that is arguably a company of yesterday kind of transition and transform into a company of tomorrow? Because I think that's harder. I mean, I think if you're going to be a startup and you're probably going to be younger, you're probably going to already be aligned with your philosophy and way of thinking, and that's why you said a lot of these companies that are started by younger individuals. So how does a company of yesterday get started to evolve into a company of tomorrow? And I assume that obviously they would need to bring their supply chain partners along as well, because their success is ultimately dependent on their trading partners to come along for the ride and the evolution as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first and foremost, you have to want to do it. If there isn't some serious leadership behind that transformation process, nothing can be accomplished, or very little can be accomplished. You can have some grassroots activity in a limited area of the organization, doing some interesting things and even applying this hype concept and so on, but you won't do anything that changes the longevity outlook of the organization unless there is some serious leadership behind it. There has to be somebody that says, we're going to turn our backs on the old ways and we're going to embrace new ways. I don't mean that in a religious, fanatical way. I'm talking a very serious business way. So you believe that if your business continues to operate the same way, you are going to fall behind and eventually fail. So if you have that motivation and you say, all right, therefore, we're going to convert into a way of operating that's faster, it's cheaper, it's leaner, it's far more dynamic and respond much better to a volatile environment. So you've made that decision. If you haven't made that decision, we don't even have a conversation. You've made that decision and you want to move forward. Now, what are the steps that you can take? So first, let me mention something I didn't mention before. Why is it that people of multiple skills in a virtual space can solve problems very quickly? Because of a phenomenon, a type of behavior that is characteristic of human beings that we call spontaneous association. A group of 12 individuals, completely different skills, faced with a problem, faced with a crisis, have this innate ability to construct a solution to the problem by combining their skills, as long as they're aware of each other's skills. We see this happening in disaster areas, natural disaster areas, in crises like Katrina or the Asian earthquake. We're able to do it just innately. Nobody needs to train us. They just need to let us do it. So in the workplace, I've seen this happening for many years, that we put people in groups and then they face the unexpected. Yeah. So spontaneous association is the fuel to this entire engine. So what's the first thing you can do? In the business reality, in the workplace, there are two types of things that happen. There's things that happen as expected, and things that were not expected and happen. And these days, they're more of the latter than of the former. The traditional organization and the traditional processes, procedures, and so on, they're all cooked for the things that are supposed to happen. There's nothing in there to deal with the things that are not supposed to happen. So what you can do is you can start creating hives that are problem-solving hives. Same principle, they have to be related to a particular customer-recognized mission. That you create hives whose role is to deal with unexpected events. And this is something that you can do without disrupting the organization. So you can create hives for problem solving without rearranging your organization. And you go through that first step and you learn from it. Then you have to take the bold step, which is to say, okay, now that our people have learned how to collaborate dynamically in these virtual spaces to resolve problems, we have to go to the next step, which is to do regular stuff, so the expected things in the same way. And that's where your classical organization is going to be challenged, because it will not work anymore and it will not be needed. And at that point, you have to deal with leadership. Like, what do you do with leaders? Because leaders do have a role, but what is that role? How does it change? So now you got to deal with that issue. And in a social operating model, a leader has a very different role. So a leader does not tell people what to do, does not tell people how to do it. A leader provides direction on what is that goal. And a leader is going to advise and counsel people if he sees, through all the collaboration that he sees going on in these virtual spaces, if he sees that, he or she sees that they're going off in the wrong direction, and they're not staying on topic. So that's what leaders do. Leaders, they work together to partition hives. Somebody has to create the hives, so leaders do that. Leaders participate not by directing people on what to do and how to solve a problem, but by giving advice, by giving direction, by giving strategy. And so leaders then cannot work in silos either. They have to work together. So, which is where I suggest the idea of a leadership hive, where you have leaders of different specialities and different talents and different focuses that are working together in figuring out how to direct all these hives in the right direction. So in summary, you really have 3 steps you can go through once you've made the deep-hearted decision that you're going to move into a new model. The first step is to use hives to resolve unexpected problems. The second is to use them not only for that, but also to process regular business. And at that point, you have to deal with the leadership model that you have, which is a command and control leadership model that has to migrate into a strategize and direct leadership model.
Great advice and roadmap there, Tony. We're kind of short on time here, so I want to get to my last question. But before I do that, this has been a fascinating topic, and I think as I'm sure the audience can appreciate. There's so many dimensions to this, and so much meat to all these different things that we talked about. So again, I invite them to kind of read your blog to get a deeper understanding of some of the things you talked about. And for those of you watching today, either live or if you're watching this on demand, I just want to mention that Tony is going to be part of the mega session panel on supply chain megatrends at the CSCMP annual conference this October in Denver. So I'm going to be moderating that panel. Tony and 2 other executives are going to be talking about a variety of different supply chain trends and topics. So if you're going to be at the CSCMP annual conference, it's a great opportunity to go to that session and be able to meet Tony live and be able to ask him questions there. Certainly we didn't get any questions today, but if you want to ask Tony any questions afterwards, if you're watching this on demand, you can go to talkinglogistics.com, find the blog posting with this episode on it, and post your question there, and I'm sure Tony will be happy to answer it. So Tony, just to end, kind of shifting gears completely, and this is again another question I like to ask all my guests, particularly because part of our audience that are students and young professionals. So it's always a great opportunity to hear from executives such as yourselves who have been in the industry, and have a firsthand look at the trends and the challenges and the opportunities moving forward. To provide your advice to students and young professionals in terms of what should they be doing today, to position themselves for a successful career moving forward.
Is that if you're young at this time, if you're in your 20s, even early 30s, at this time is on your side. So work reality, the business workplace is going to transform itself into something that is compatible with the way you see the world and the way that you communicate and the many habits that have become almost second nature to you. Don't be discouraged when you get into a workplace where there is no social networking. People are still using Outlook calendar to book their times. You still have to go to a boss to get a decision made. Things are slow. Don't get too discouraged because this isn't going to last. The thing to be watchful of is whether you are in a company of yesterday or whether you're in a company that may become a company of tomorrow if it isn't already. This you need to keep an eye on. And that depends on the leadership that company has. If you have enlightened, inspired leaders that are giving you great ideas, that there seems to be a lot of innovation going on, then you're in a good place. If you're in a company where leaders are still in the times of yesterday, they think the way they did 20 years ago, it's all very stale, lots of meetings, everything goes very slowly, decisions aren't made. Don't accept that that's the way the world works. It's not. That's the way the world used to work. Any organization that's slow in decision making, that doesn't innovate, that's not coming up with new ideas all the time, you don't feel that you are in a vibrant environment with lots of excitement and stuff, get the hell out of there, find another job. Because you are probably close to a dinosaur graveyard if that's where you work. And it's very real. I mean, if you were 55 years old and you have 5 or 10 years left to go, I would say don't bother. But if you're 25 years old, you're wasting your time because this place isn't gonna be around 10 years from now. And 10 years from now, you'll be 35. Like, what are you doing there? So these places of excitement and these places of energy and new things and unpredictable things happening, they exist. Find them and go work there. And if nothing else, remember this: the skills that you have learned in the past 10 years as you were growing up, these skills are very needed for the world of tomorrow. And so learn how to use them, improve them, the way you communicate, the way you multitask, the way you network with your friends, the way even when you're doing projects in university, learn and perfect the skill of working without ever sitting next to your friend and working in virtual spaces. This is what's going to drive the world tomorrow. So learn them, exploit them, look for those exciting companies, and remember, time is on your side, and next 10 years are going to be yours.
Great advice, Tony. Very impassioned advice as well. So with that, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today. And I want to thank everybody who's joined the program today live with us for attending. And to remind everyone that just about every Thursday we have great guests like Tony on talking about leading trends and opportunities in the supply chain logistics industry. So we hope to see you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. And with that, have a great day, everyone.